scripture reading, prayer, no interruption from the outside world. I had no choice but to seek answers, and thank goodness I had access to some of the best answers available to mankind in the person and work of Jesus.
Hello, my friend, and welcome to this Wednesday episode of A Call to Leadership. I'm so glad you are here. This 4-part series with Jeremy Smith embarks on the journey of one individual toward his relationship with loving God and loving people. It's quite inspiring. This is only the second installment. The first installment, if you haven't listened to it, I suggest you do. This first one was the journey of just trial and tribulation, and this second part is going to be facing some consequences for some really difficult decisions that he made in the moment. And it's so engaging, so inspiring. It just speaks to my heart in terms of how we can find new hope even through the tragedies of life. Let's pick back up where we left off, and Jeremy sharing exactly what's about to happen in his life, which is a complete detour from what he thought life would look like.
And I'm so thankful that he didn't die, right? I would not be here if that were the case. Or maybe I would just be getting out, right? But that ended up being the catalyst for my conversion. I literally got saved in county jail, and nobody asked me to invite Jesus to live in my chest so I won't go to hell. Nobody had me say any magic words. I didn't check a box. I didn't put my hand in the air while nobody's looking. Like, I was just reading my Bible in my jail cell in Montgomery County Jail looking for answers, because I had, not only did I hit rock bottom, but I found out that rock bottom had a basement.
Jeez.
And sorry, I might get emotional, but this is why, by the way, I love apologetics, and I love answering questions about religion, morality, Christianity specifically, but all these big questions, because I had questions. Are you good? Are you for me? Are you there? Do you hear me? Why should I trust you? I feel like a slave. Am I a slave? If I am, I'm out. But I don't know, right? Those were the vulnerable questions. In John's Gospel, 15th chapter, 15th verse, I'll paraphrase, but Jesus essentially says, guys, I'm not calling you slaves. I'm calling you my friends. Everything that my dad in heaven has made known to me, I'm making known to you. It's like, look, slaves don't know their master's business. It's not how we're relating right now. You're my friends. Nate, I wept. I was 17 years old. I had been tried as an adult. I didn't know how long I was going to be on this vacation, this incarceration vacation. It was scary. But in that moment, I believe that I got saved. I repented and I believed the gospel. And by the way, what is the gospel? Well, the short version is Jesus was prophesied. Jesus lived the life that we should have lived, died the death that we should have died, was the Son of God, and he died for our sin, right? Not his own. And rose on the third day to validate his lofty claims, and boy, were they lofty. And it just made sense. Everything changed. I wept. I started writing letters to my mom, to my friends, to people that I felt like I had wronged. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what I was doing. And I was saying the same thing to God. I am so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know who I was rejecting. I was rejecting a caricature of you. You're not a distant God enforcing a bunch of arbitrary do's and don'ts. And you do care. And you demonstrated that care by putting on skin, just like the skin that I wear. And you've revealed yourself to us in this person. Like, It was mind-blowing. I got saved, man, in jail, and the jailhouse conversion stuck. That's maybe not the same for everybody. For me, it wasn't like, I'm going to tell the judge that I'm a good Christian. Honestly, man, like once I got saved, I stopped asking God to get me out of there. I started accepting responsibility for what got me there, which was, on the one hand, unfair circumstances. On the other hand, poor choices.
Right.
And only God knows the exact ratios, by the way. The accumulation of suffering that we all endure is a combination of those two things: unfair circumstances and bad choices. Only God knows the ratios, right?
It's good.
For me, I knew the bit of the gospel, right? Like that you're a sinner in desperate need of some righteousness that you cannot produce yourself. All of your self-salvation plans, whether it's sex and drugs and rock and roll or obeying all the rules for all the wrong reasons, which is the younger brother and the elder brother in the tale of the two brothers, right? We talk about the prodigal son, but the elder brother had his own problems, bigger problems, arguably. But all that stuff, that self-salvation plan, like, oh my gosh, like it's empty. And the gospel became real, and my whole world just turned upside down, Nate. And I feel like I'm talking a little more than I should right now, but
I'd stop you.
The morality question, though, this is so important because absent an objective moral lawgiver, and I challenge students with this. This is mind-blowing. I hope none of my parents are listening here, parents of students, because sometimes in one-on-one, if I get that kid that's very rebellious and he's just like, yeah, morality's all relative. You do you, bro. Do what you feel is right. So yeah, go ahead. But does that apply to Ted Bundy? Does that apply to Jeffrey Dahmer? Does that apply to Adolf Hitler? Like, if what you really believe is that we are all just the creators of our own relativistic morality, then you have no right to tell anybody to stop doing them. You do you, bro. That's a statement, and those words have meaning. And so if you want Jeffrey Dahmer to do you, bro, then you really need to think about what you're saying, because everybody has standards. And honestly, that is C.S. Lewis. He said, and I think this was in the appendix of his book, The Abolition of Man, but I could be wrong. Anyway, Lewis said that at first glance, it seems like morality is very different from culture to culture, depending on where you're born and when you're born. And it's interesting, too, that you have this Islamic background, right? Because it seems like that at the surface level. But Lewis says this, and I agree with him. He says, but if you do some digging, you'll see that ever since mankind has been writing things down, however long that's been, that there's certain moral categories that tend to repeat, right? And he gave a couple examples. He said, murder. All right. 10 Commandments, right? Thou shalt not kill, right? Okay. Thou shalt not murder. Well, in every culture, virtually every culture, taking a life is tricky. Almost every culture would agree that you ought not murder willy-nilly without justification. Cold-blooded, purposeless, wanton murder for the sake of murder. There aren't many cultures, if any, really, that upheld that as a standard that's worthy of honor, right? Now, different cultures will define justified murder in different ways, but every culture would say you ought not murder. Same with lying, same with many of the other commandments. Lewis's argument is that morality is actually pretty consistent from the dawn of time to now, right? As far as human beings are concerned. He said what's inconsistent are the ways that we apply it. And that's where you get these things that look like major differences in moral codes. But underneath it, well, you ought not murder. And then you get into questions and debates about justification for murder, which that's all over the place, right?
Right.
Anyway, if you don't have an outside standard that you're measuring behavior, and by the way, I love your definition of morality here because it presupposes so many things. Even these ideas of right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust, fair and unfair, already, we're in the realm of philosophy and theology. Someone with a purely naturalistic explanation for everything that we see today, including our moral compass, they can't say things like good and evil. Those are theological ideas. You can't even say things like fair or unfair. There are favorable mutations, there are unfavorable mutations, and might makes right. Survival of the fittest is the governing ethic. But it's not even an ethic because, again, ethics, morality, these are philosophical and theological ideas. That's empty. If the origin story is random chance and chaos and we are nothing but animated meat responding to stimuli, then words like evil, they're meaningless.
Right.
They're meaningless. And so that's why as a teenager, before Jesus got a hold of me, as a teenager, I actually felt like it was right to become the strongest, survival of the fittest, right? The most manipulative, like whatever I needed to do to win, to survive. And if all these other sheep and these lemmings don't see what I see, I'm only proving that I'm more evolved. This is a lot of what was motivating those Columbine kids. This is why I'm glad. Again, thanks, Dave, if you're listening. I'm glad my friend and I were at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong motives, and that my story played out the way it did. Because if not for God's intervention, I'm sure I would have been in prison for something far worse.
Yeah.
Because I had seared my conscience to the degree that it was the means justified the ends. I would do or say anything to get my way. Sorry, my point in bringing all that up, though, is this idea of morality. I really think there are only a couple of options. Either it is relative, and it's all just animated meat responding to stimuli, and there's no difference between the pleasure that you get from eating a ham sandwich and the pleasure that Ted Bundy got from raping and killing innocent young girls. Because it's all just chemicals. In the grand scheme of things, what does it matter? The love you feel for your kids is no different than a shot of heroin. It's stimulating a lot of the same chemicals and receptors, right? Again, that's meaningless. Rise above that. So if you're strong enough, rise above that, man. And this is why I don't condone things like school shootings or bullying or lying or hurting people for your gain. That's wrong, but I have a reason for calling it wrong. I have an objective standard that I'm using to measure what is right and what is wrong. If it's all just random chance and chaos and animated meat responding to stimuli, we can talk about what we prefer. That's fair. That's fine. And you can even talk about what you prefer with the majority of people and come up with some okay rules with majority votes, right?
Right.
But is it objectively right or wrong? I mean, the majority preferred to kill Jewish people in Nazi Germany, right? And other people bought into this idea as well. And so the majority doesn't necessarily create good morals, right? If I'm relying on my own sense of good or evil, right or wrong, then that's going to change with my feelings. It's going to change with my mood. It's going to change with whatever image I'm wearing to get the most clicks or likes on social media. Or in my case, in your case, it was like who sits at the cool kids table.
Right.
So yeah, man, morality. Oh my goodness. I love talking about morality because everybody, and this is the first chapter, by the way, I think, or first couple chapters of Mere Christianity, which again, C.S. Lewis, right? One of my heroes, one of your heroes.
I agree.
where he says, the guy that says there's no such thing as right or wrong will immediately contradict himself if you cut in front of him in line, or if he gives you a 20, but you give him change for a 10, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. That was a long-winded.
That was so good. And the way you unrolled that was very precious and special and beautiful. But not only that, it was very clear. And you've been in a place where you've been able to disseminate these deep philosophical, rightly said, behavioral, non-scientific, if you will, systems of belief. I think it's important to just spend a few moments on this objective reality piece,
yes,
right? Because before the jailhouse, there's a lot of subjective decisions. And it's based on me being the central piece or the central character in this story, where during that time where you have your conversion, your awakening, and you recognize that Jesus becomes the central character in the story, not because of his own dominion, and I want to use these words carefully, not because he is someone who is going to harm you, but because through that friendship, that relationship, that contract.
A contract of love. Self-sacrificial love.
Correct, which is perfect, because that is the next step of this conversation is humanity in our natural selves. We are self-preserving. Survival of the fittest. It's self-preservation.
Right.
Where Jesus has a radically different perspective and a radically different approach. Self-sacrifice. It's mind-boggling. It's the antithesis of what the natural self is inclined to do. And in some ways, you question, you say, is this really the answer? And as you begin to progress, you're in a state now, you're 17 years old, and you have an awakening, and you begin to say, I need to take responsibility for my actions. I need to take ownership of the belief that I hurt people, and that's wrong. Not because of a morality that was an abusive authority in my own life growing up, but because I'm beginning to embrace a pathway that truly leads to healing and wholeness in my own life. And that's something that you likely had not experienced.
Nope. No. And it was the person and work of Jesus, God personified, right? Nothing could have convinced me. And by the way, Jesus is a good moral teacher, helpful, can get you part of the way in terms of human flourishing, getting along with folks, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, this went way beyond some like proverbial wisdom or wise words or wise sayings. Like Jesus's words, Jesus's person, Jesus's work as recorded in scripture, but also in history. Important subject, maybe another podcast, but it changed me from the inside out. You know, lots of people have impact events and it can change the course of their life, right? And not all of it is Christianity, right? Like you could find hot yoga and be a better person. You can find Oprah's Book of the Month Club and be a better person. For me, though, there was a fundamental shift. It was as if my computer was rebooted.
Yeah.
It was full of viruses, right?
Yeah.
And then it just restarted, and now suddenly things were clear. Not perfect. It's important to note, right? Not everything about me changed in a miracle moment, but enough changed for me to be noticeably different to the people that knew me before my conversion, and noticeably different to myself. Like suddenly, it wasn't just that I didn't want to do some bad thing because it made me feel bad or because I just didn't want to get in trouble. You know, fear of consequence is quite a motivator, right? For me, it was a new layer of conviction, a new understanding of my place in the world, like you said, right? I am not the center of this universe. I am not God. And I don't know best. My best decisions landed me in the worst place, right? And I say best, like quote unquote.
Right.
And it just changed. And when I got out of jail, people noticed that I was different. But there were a lot of things about me that didn't change. I was gone for a year. It was a year and a week, April to April.
That's a good clip.
Yeah, 96 to 97.
That's a good clip. I'm hearing some patterns emerging, and I'd like to ask you what you think about this as you're unfolding your story, which is just amazing testament. I'm hearing this relationship between accomplishment and acceptance. And you were rejected when you were young by your stepdad. And you began to experience rebelliousness for authority figures who could not sustain the contract, while seeking acceptance of the groups of individuals who you did not have to make the contract with, but it gave you a sense of value.
Identity as well.
And identity.
Value and identity, yes.
Through the accomplishment. When you meet Jesus in that prison cell, there's no need for achievement, zero need for accomplishment, 100% identity in him. It's such a game changer in how we perceive reality and how we perceive our purpose and how we perceive this experience called life that can be very confusing, can be super traumatic. And someone listening might say, I haven't gone through an ounce of the challenges and the traumas that you faced. However, as I listen, it helps me to understand perhaps some of the challenges that I've faced, maybe some blind spots that perhaps aren't as striking, yet still leave me in a place to where I have this need to find morality in and of myself through my own acceptance, through achievement. And your story speaks volumes to that. I mean, unbelievably, because this year that you've spent in prison, I suspect this is a time of growth for you.
Oh,
massive.
Tremendous. Real quick, I got my GED. I went through Alcoholics Anonymous, graduated, went through Narcotics Anonymous, graduated. I got some decent counseling while I was there, believe it or not. Like some of the first really good interactions I had with caring people. And my story's not like everyone's. I was very fortunate. God was very gracious to me. But yes, so many good. My prison experience was upside down. I mean, it was scary. There's some things that went down that, thank God, it hadn't gone down a different way, right? I was protected, I believe, in spite of even some bad choices while incarcerated, right? I was still a dumb kid with a big mouth. But all that to say, it was an upside down experience for me, 100%. Scripture reading, prayer, no interruption from the outside world. I had no choice but to seek answers, and thank goodness I had access to some of the best answers available to mankind, again, in the person and work of Jesus.
The prison experience, I've spent a few days in jail here and there, but being, and even in a little house arrest, supervisory probation, just doing dumb stuff, that had to be so scary. Just with the preconceived notions that we all have, many of us, about going in jail, right?
Yes.
Your life, many question marks like, okay, what's going to happen? Am I going to be violated, abused? Am I going to be killed? Who knows?
Yep.
Were those going through your mind?
Of course.
Of course, yeah.
I'd seen all the movies, right? Prior to going in. And I'll never forget, in county, I felt like, in some ways, like I was preparing for gladiator games. Because I was in county jail for 7 months. So the bulk of my incarceration was in a county jail, which was a relatively safe environment, right? And I was working out every day. I was running in place. I'm shadow boxing. Like, I am trying to become the kind of person that will successfully navigate prison life. I'm also talking with other people in and out of county that have done time in prison. I'm studying. I'm doing my homework. I'm doing my research, right? Love researching. I was doing research. And yet, by God's grace, like when I finally ended up in Graham, medium security penitentiary, actually, I'll never forget this. There was a guy there. I was coming in. I was in the receiving end, and this guy was leaving. Older guy. An old African-American guy, I mean, probably in his 50s, maybe 60s, gray hair. And he looked over at me. We were as close as you and I are, both cuffed. He was going out. I was going in. He's like, man, how old are you? I was like, 17, sir. I was like, He's like, you scared? I was like, no. He's like, you are. He's like, that's okay. He said 2 things. Don't hold your head too high. Don't hold your head too low. I was like, well, that's profound. And it was really true, right? And I tell my kids these same things. And the stakes are much lower. But hey, like if you're going to get noticed by the teacher, make sure you get noticed for the right reasons. If you're going to be the know-it-all, all right, well, that can help you with your relationship with your teacher, but that might hurt you with your relationship with your peers. So balance that out. If you're going to be the class clown, that can help you with your peers, but it can hurt you with your teacher. Don't hold your head too high. Don't hold your head too low. Blend in, right? Go with the flow. And of course, I don't share this information with my kids. Thankfully, I don't have to. But I was also told, don't gamble. And don't hook up with any gangs, especially in receiving, because you don't need to. This is something I learned, Nate, because of the overcrowding, right, of the prison population. And this is back in the 90s, right? I think it's worse now, but you didn't go straight to your final destination. In some cases, they don't even know where your final destination is until beds open up, right? In my case, violent offense, but I also was a first-time adult offender. In my case, Graham, medium security penitentiary, but I was in this receiving area, which is where it's a temporary place. And this is where everybody waits for their final destination. And you could be there for a couple weeks. You could be there for a couple months. Kind of depends on your situation. What's so beautiful about this space is that it's safer than general population. And the reason is nobody wants to act up in receiving. Because if you act up in receiving, they're going to send you to the place where people go that act up a lot, right? If you don't want to go to gladiator school, if you don't want to end up in a max prison and the worst of the worst, don't act up in receiving, right? Because if you prove that you're a problem inmate, well, they're going to put you where they put problem inmates. And so for me, it was like, man, my cellmate, and I won't name his name, but he's another 17-year-old kid, about the same size as me. We called him 46 because he was doing 46 years for attempted murder. There were rapists. There were, I don't remember any, like pedophiles, but I do remember every crime you could imagine, right? Again, don't hold your head too high. Don't hold it too low. And a lot of my social skills as a kid really helped me out here too. Even though I was a Christian, I was still relying on some street smarts to make it through this scary situation, right? I'm an artist, right? I mean, I doodle. Let's say it that way. I like to doodle. I learned quickly that a lot of guys, they like to do artwork. And if they couldn't do artwork, they needed someone who could to draw pictures for their kids or their girlfriends. And so I made essentially like a small business. I created a small business and I would do, little roses or little whatever for the kids and for the girls. And I had guys coming in my cell all the time. So that what that said to the rest of the population was, this guy knows people. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize this was happening. I thought I was just socializing and doing favors. And there was a certain degree of like trade, but I did a lot for free too, to the guys with the social capital.
That's right. Smart guy.
And some of it was like instinctive, right? And some of it was calculated, but all of it was God's grace. But I ended up qualifying for a program for first offenders, first-time adult offenders called Impact Incarceration. So I bypassed general population. This was a miracle too, you weren't supposed to qualify for this program with a violent offense. I had 2 violent offenses on my juvenile record and 1 violent offense on my adult record. And yet I qualified somehow.
Yeah.
And my mom didn't have money for an attorney. This just happened. State's attorney said, yeah, go ahead and give him that. I don't know how. Anyway, so I bypassed general population. After I left medium security, I went to a minimum security place, which was also a holding place. And boy, was it funny. Like, talk about hard time. Roller skating parties, movies that weren't even in the theaters yet, good food. Like, it was pretty funny.
Yeah.
Like, I thought, man, I could stay here and I'd be okay, right? But I qualified for this program, which shortened my sentence considerably. When I got to this impact incarceration program, sorry, I'm rabbit trailing, but it was amazing because it was modeled after the Marine boot camp program. But instead of learning to kill people, like, in addition to all the physical training and the breaking down and the essentially torturous physical training, I mean, it's up before the sun's up and it is just work nonstop. And you are pushed to your absolute limit. And they do it on purpose because part of this is a breaking down and a rebuilding. But at the same time, all of the corrections officers, most of them with military training, unlike the military, like Army, Navy, Marines, where they really do want to see you succeed, a lot of these guys want to see you fail because they know that if you quit or if you get kicked out, you go serve your sentence. It's a shorter sentence, but it's conditional. Nate, I'm telling you, I had a 3-year sentence with the option of boot camp, which meant that I would go home in 6 months or less, okay? Depending on how long I was in receiving. I saw dudes with 15-year sentences that could have gone home in 6 months. And because of their strained relationship with authority, because of their pride, because of their own moral codes, you will not disrespect me, right? It's a high priority in prison. I saw guys go ahead and accept a decade or more because they felt disrespected, because they wouldn't let an officer yell in their face, or they didn't want to shave their hair, they didn't want to shine their boots, or if the whole dorm gets punished because one guy's talking, they didn't think that was fair and they wanted to talk about that, right? And I remember every push-up, every verbal attack from an officer, and some of them seemed to be well-intended, right? Some of those guys there seemed like they cared. Some of them did not deserve the power and the authority that they had. And that's another conversation, but every one of us, right? Whatever little authority we have, we abuse it to some extent. Nobody's perfect. But there were some folks in there that really got off on making people quit or getting guys aggravated. It really gets you to swing on them.
Yeah.
And I remember every push-up, every time I was disrespected by an officer, all I kept saying was, this is one step closer to home. You're not going to get me off my game. And some of that, I think God gave to me through skateboarding, frankly. It seems like these are unrelated, but they are related. Everybody got a skateboard when Michael J. Fox was tailgating on the back of that Jeep in Back to the Future in 1980, whatever it was, 85. Right? Everybody had a skateboard after that. By next Christmas, only a few of your buddies were still riding that skateboard. Why is that? Because skateboarding hurts. Once you take that first fall, that's when you decide, am I in or am I off to something that's easier? There's something about skateboarding, man, and a lot of sports, right? Especially a lot of the individual sports where you're only motivated by yourself. Mm-hmm. Like you fall, you get hurt, you break a bone, you get a knee surgery. For what? So you can land a kickflip down a 6-stair set? Who cares? I remember there are times when I got hurt when nobody was watching. Why? Because I wanted to conquer that skateboard. I was conquering myself, conquering my fear. I'm so thankful that God gave me skateboarding. That taught me so much my dad didn't teach me, right? And again, seems unrelated, but it's not. Mr. Wiggles, one of the original members of the Rocksteady crew. You remember, like we talk about clubs. Maybe we'll get there. I don't know what time it is, but this is in another life. But I used to help with party promotion in that club world, right? But I always I towed the line between like the hip hop community and the rave community. And when I say hip hop, by the way, I don't mean rap necessarily. I mean like the 4 traditional elements of hip hop, which would be DJing, graffiti, breakdancing, and MCing, right? And that scene was important to me. And I loved that scene. I loved that subculture. It was rebellious. It was cool. It was gritty. And there was a lot of overlap between the skateboarding world and the hip hop world in the 90s and into the early 2000s. And we brought Mr. Wiggles in, this very knowledgeable OG, right? Original gangster of that world. And this is beautiful. He said he felt like hip hop was God's gift to inner city New Yorkers. And all it was the arts, poetry, drawing, dancing, instruments, but it was accessible to underprivileged people. And it wasn't highbrow, right? And he said, hip hop saved my life, man. He said, God gave me breakdancing, popping, locking, a robot, right? As a little kid in the 70s. He said, everybody else is looking up to these pimps and these drug dealers. And it's like, man, I just wanted to look like a robot on the street corner because that's the coolest thing I had ever seen. And I adopted a lot of that, just subculture mentality. But God is so faithful to give us these clues. And I'm not saying that Christians talk a lot about natural revelation and special revelation. And even Paul says that there's not a human being that's ever lived or ever will live that can say, well, I have a good excuse because you didn't show me enough. Paul says, nope, nobody will have that excuse. Everybody has been shown enough to know there's something out there, something supernatural, beyond time, beyond space, not created, right?
With an objective morality.
With standards, right? I mean, look, if we're designed, then there's got to be a designer, and there's purpose. There's a teleological argument here. But my point in bringing all that up is just to say that I had rejected so much truth. And at first, it was like, I was a dumb kid and I was scared. And it ended up graduating into, I would rather be my own God. I would rather become the monster than be subjected to monstrous authority, right? And it got really wicked, maybe even demonic. But once I saw things for what they were, and my space was invaded by an outside presence, right? It's not like I just connected the dots and came to this conclusion. Something invaded my space. Christians would say the Holy Spirit regenerated my heart, right? I was born again. And it wasn't something that I could have made up. It wasn't something that I could have figured out on my own. And yet it was a continuation of truth that I had already known and rejected. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense, and it
ties right in. And this is going to have to be a part 2 because we've done so well in really laying a foundation for the direction of your life. Because when we do this for our next episode, we'll talk about how that access that you talked about with the music and the hip hop for the underprivileged, especially with you and growing, I suspect that it informed your desire to provide access to truth, to God, to those who do not have access to it otherwise, which is where you are today. It's going to be good. Yes, it is a barn burner. Yes, it's a cliffhanger. Yes, it's a to be continued. But Jeremy, your story has inspired and truly affected me in a new way because we've been friends for a long time. And this is not rehearsed. This is not something we said, hey, let's talk about.
No, this. I had no idea what we were talking about really when I came in. And I don't lead with it, Nate. Like, it's kind of weird to say, hi, I'm a convicted felon. By the way, my name's Jeremy. You know, I don't lead with it. It's so funny, and I don't mean to interrupt, but because of the kind of work I do, everybody assumes that I'm like a second generation PK, seminary graduate, like straight laced, grew up in church,
preacher's kid.
Yes, that's right. Sorry, preacher's kid. Right, I'm using Christianese, but I don't always correct people. Right, I just don't have the time, and it's fine. People can think what they want. But when I do get a chance to share my testimony or to talk about my story, the reactions are interesting, to say the least.
Absolutely. And the connections with this morality. And as we close, looking at that definition, you've heard me talk about it and you've looked through it. Is there anything that you would add or subtract to this definition of morality? As you're reading through it, you know, we've got a lot of ideas of what morality is. But as you look through it, I'd like to have this as a chapter and before we have our next chapter conversation.
Do you want a short answer now?
Yes.
I agree that morality is a set of principles or values that guide an individual's conduct, ... right? This is a longer definition. It's either an illusion. Again, this is the secular humanism, right? This is a purely natural explanation. Sure, maybe we evolved to be cooperative and altruistic, but it's still an illusion. Maybe a million years from now, the way that you reproduce is you and your wife couple, and then she eats your head off like a praying mantis, right? So it's an illusion. It's floating. It's relative. It changes depending on the needs of the species or depending on the whims of the individual, right? So it's either an illusion or it's man's attempt to make sense out of objective standards that we know are there, but because we're, as Christians would say, imperfect. I heard a guy just recently say that the doctrine of original sin is the only like Christian dogma that is scientifically provable, right? You can just look at the world and objectively measure. So sociology, right, can say we all are imperfect and we all fall short. Maybe it's not scientifically proven in that empirical sense, but it's very obvious. Anyway, sorry. So either it's an illusion, that is to say morality is either an illusion or the various streams of ethics and morality that humans come up with are our best attempt to achieve the standard, right? Or to hit the target. It's funny that in some translations, the word sin actually means missing the mark. And so it's not necessarily about, oh, these naughty things you ought not do. It's a little bit more about your design, the teleology, right? Like, what is your purpose? Why are you here for? Like, what are these human vessels supposed to be doing here as individuals and as communities and as a whole? And how do humans flourish? And I think sin is missing the mark in terms of what like makes and allows for humans to flourish. And kind of jumping back to the things that I was thinking about when you first started this conversation, everybody is trying to get, I think, good needs fulfilled. But a lot of us choose to fulfill those good needs in bad ways, right? I think it was, well, there was some philosopher / theologian that said, what drives one man to religion and another man to suicide and another man to drugs and alcohol and another man to monogamy and another man to womanizing. It's all the same thing. We just want to be happy. Unless you're a masochist and you have a strange, but even then, pain makes you happy. You just want to be happy. And I think that man's attempt to create moral systems is actually a clue to this reality, right? That we have purpose, that there's a meaning, that we're designed, like design implies designer, and that we're here for a purpose and a reason. And we can either be closer to that purpose or further away from it. And without special revelation, I think it all just boils down to man's attempt to either save himself or attain salvation through rule keeping, or man's attempt to save himself and attain salvation through liberation from the rules. And again, this is the story, the parable of the elder brother and the younger brother. You're rebelling against God either by obeying all the rules for all the wrong reasons, or disregarding all the rules and liberating yourself, right? But you're both rebels.
You're both rebels. And I can't wait to hear how that rebelliousness turned into the ministry that you are so blessed to lead today. Thanks for being here, brother.
It was my pleasure.
Rebels indeed, and rebelliousness comes with cost. Sometimes there is warrant for being a rebel. Sometimes there is a dire consequence. Well, Jeremy has been so gracious to be transparent and vulnerable as he embarks on this journey with us. And it just gets better. I can't wait for you to listen into the next 2 installments as he explains just what happens in prison and what happens after when you realize your true calling. I'm so thankful you joined us today. Can't wait for you to listen in again. I'm Dr. Nate Sala, and this is A Call to Leadership.